Welcome to the presentation given to Sarah Redfern High School in June 2021 around developing preliminary and HSC skills for heritage and identity. This is a collection of ideas and strategies for teachers to help them to build the capacity of their HSC students. It was particularly orientated to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in Western Sydney undertaking Aboriginal Studies, years 11 and 12. In that class we also had a number of Pacifica or First Nations Māori and other non-Indigenous students in the class. So these are some of the skills that we hope to give to students, given that many students feel that the HSC is perhaps the most challenging thing that they will ever experience, but it's also one of the most difficult things to navigate because they feel that information that they should know perhaps is hidden from them. This came out of some work that I did in 2016 and 17, running HSC boot camps around New South Wales to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. I'm a Gunditj Mara woman, and it makes my job perhaps easier because I can work with students at a level where cultural knowledge and understanding is given through me about the HSC paper, and they feel more confident around understanding that. One of the first things I do with students is to get them to know their timeframes and how difficult it's going to be for them to plan an effective study regime if they haven't already been studying and planning to study and writing notes, but also that it's not impossible. So with this particular cohort, we're about 168 days out, and it's an important part of the planning. With the Year 11 group, of course, they were about 533 days out. But it's important to give students that indication of how long away the exam is, so that they can see perhaps the urgency around getting a study plan underway, but also how and what they need to study. So we showed the students particularly the links between heritage and identity between the preliminary course and the HSC course. In the preliminary course, students are to study information up to the 1960s, and in the HSC course, of course, it's post the 1960s. And we went through a range of activities that looked at particular aspects of their local community, who it was. They were, of course, in the Dharawal area. Who were the better ways, who are the elders and community people that they might be engaging with, getting their writing styles under control and practicing writing, but also doing that in respectfully and meaningful ways by recognising their community, using capital letters, and trying not to create binaries in their writing. When they are planning for exam revision, we showed the Year 11s what the teachers actually see and how they would plan for exams, using the syllabus pages and saying to the students that all syllabus documents are open to all students, and this is not just a teacher document, but in fact it's an important study document for those students entering Year 11 and 12. We looked at some of the work that they had already been looking at. I was lucky enough to have a practicum student in working with these students for a number of weeks, so we were able to work on some details around the preliminary course, around the three spheres of Aboriginal ways of knowing, or epistemologies and ontologies, and that there was some other information that we could use in our examples that we have to write about in terms of the Dharawal community. Of course, there are always things that the students may have experienced and worked with, and there are other elders in communities that have written information and published information, so making sure that students understood where they could find information that could give them a local example in their HSCs, and also making sure that they understood the preliminary features of the syllabus, showing them some key visual ways to understand the effects of colonisation in their communities, remembering that the prelim course was up to the 1960s and the HSC course is post the 1960s. We also looked at the effect of colonisation and using the social systems and languages features that were being asked for in the syllabus document, and what are the sorts of things that students might need to understand and work on more, but particularly with languages and the links to the prevention of punishment of the crime of genocide, and Australia being a signatory to that in 1948, and what were the definitions of genocide and how that linked to colonisation, the destruction of social systems and the destruction of Aboriginal languages, but also the importance of language revitalisation when we talked about the HSC. Also gave students experiences in looking at key images of racism and prejudice, whether it be covert, covered up racism, like the image on the right, or whether it be deliberate racism. We gave students experiences in understanding that in the prelim course. We also looked at some of the other things that were key driving forces that students needed to talk about in terms of the prelim course and the HSC, talking about economic power shifts, religious orientations are all part of those prelim course requirements, building background knowledge for students. Of course, then we looked at the construction of racism, the origins of racism, the pseudosciences, phrenology, what was happening elsewhere in the world, and how some of this physiognomy became part of the media of the time and the construction foundations for the origins of racism, and how it continues to be part of the contribution to stereotyping and discrimination. Then we looked at the importance of undertaking research, in referencing our work, looking at particular protocols, whose knowledge is it, how do we acknowledge different elders in our communities like Uncle Ivan, that Dharawal have different spellings, and that all of those are appropriate, but we must use capital letters. Finally, we looked at, for the HSC group, which we're in together with the preliminary group, some of the key words used in the HSC and whether or not they understood those words. For example, the main words found in the last few years of HSC papers are analyse, assess, compare, contrast, critically analyse or critically evaluate, examine and synthesise. And they are where students will gain the greatest marks in the HSC papers. We also looked at some of those important learn tos and learn abouts, so students understood what they were required to do in the HSC and the sorts of content that they had to provide comprehensive notes and study notes for themselves around, that they could use local examples also to express some of those dot points. Finally, we looked at examples of possible HSC questions and how we would construct those answers, showing them the sorts of paragraphs and structures that they might be using. An example from the community of how, in this example, how Aboriginality and identity or confirmation of Aboriginality perhaps already set up as a contribution to giving Aboriginal communities economic independence were perhaps also not bringing economic independence to those Aboriginal young people who are disconnected or have been removed because they could not prove Aboriginality in the ways that these institutions require. So that was a fairly good overview of what we were doing and how we were achieving the sorts of things with HSC students. And finally we looked at the 2018 HSC paper and looking at how that would be presented in a final exam question, such as heritage and identity, and that students had to incorporate a source, and of course the source was from Anita Heiss, Am I Black Enough for You? And giving students very clear indications here of how they needed to articulate the use of the source to get the higher marks and the higher bands in the HSC. But also then we discussed a number of other ways in which local examples could be incorporated, such as Young Dark Emu or Kui Mitiga from the Darug community, and how students are always able to use different examples and transition sentences so to show and their own knowledge, which is a requirement of the HSC Aboriginal Studies paper. So overall, the takeaways for the groups, the preliminary and HSC group, were make notes regularly, keep them in your topic areas, place writing responses, practice some of those writing responses of at least 4 to 6 sentences every week in different topic areas that they're studying. Start to write with respect using capital A and capital E for elders, looking at the HSC expectations and going and having a look at the Assessment and Resource Centre site, that they need to get clips and folders and make the study easier, not harder, creating dream walls for each of your HSC topics and communities that they're studying, and basically to be a winner and do your best in every single question. So I hope that was a bit of a coverage of what was undertaken in the HSC boot camps, and anybody can contact me about those boot camps and running them in schools if that's something people are interested in. Thank you.